This is the beginning of a 4-week series titled Roadblocks to Republic. And I had someone ask me already, with the topics I chose for this, well, gee whiz, those are the only 4? And I said no, which means another one's probably coming, which means yes. Going back to let's call it the earlier part of the country's history. You can go further. In fact, you can pick anything you want here to be a roadblock, but I try to pick something I thought was these items that are more pronounced here, especially with the beginnings of the country, because I don't think we teach it well enough in the schools that that period, even prior to the Battle of Yorktown, because when you look back at the history of Benedict Arnold, he thought he saw something here in 1778 that he didn't think the country might not last, or what's going to be a country might not make it to be a country, which is one of the reasons he turns traitor. He's interesting from the perspective, he's always known here as a traitor to the American cause, right? Yeah, but then again in 1741 when he's born a British subject, so he turns on the British by 1770. And then when he thinks things aren't going too well here, by 1778, 1779, he turns against the people he joined. So he's really a traitor twice, if you really think of it that way. Opportunist, perhaps, maybe. Of course, he was in debt, too. That didn't help. But this series here is, the first one today is Mutiny in the Ranks. Again, it's part of that progression which you see by the end of Yorktown, by the end of the Battle of Yorktown. Things aren't all that rosy here. They really aren't. And I'm going to get into the state of the Continental Army by this point. It's really, we kind of missed this. We kind of missed this. And next week it's going to be followed by Shays' Rebellion. Yeah, which is an incident that helps. Well, they didn't need any prompting here because they didn't like it anyway, but it does reinforce some of your founders' notions that democracy doesn't work. There's a discussion for you. And then after that, again another roadblock, the Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798 here. And then the last one's going to be Flirtation with Dictatorship. The subtitle there is Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln. In America's first industrialized war? Yeah. Yeah, it shows you where that's going. It shows you what's going to be happening in 1917. It shows you what's going to be happening after 1941. You're getting the shades of that in the American Civil War. So yeah, there'll be other. This is part 1 of a series such as Roadblocks. You can have a part 2, which I'm probably going to do eventually. I'm probably also having to have discussions outside. Probably going to be doing something with the 70th. This June 25 is the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. Yep. Yeah, the Forgotten War. If you were any of you guys who were in the service then. So, but anyway, but this one here is interesting from the perspective. This is where the United States Army is forming, and it's an important step toward where we are going to go as a country after the Battle of Yorktown. And so it begs the question, well, how does this so-called army start? A lot of these guys were farmers. Even at the time of the Constitutional Convention, 90% of Americans, if you want to call them that, are farmers. We're not an industrialized state. They're farmers. But at this point, interestingly enough, when the French Revolution started, the French Revolution is probably more interesting than ours. It's got more moving parts. We didn't have it set yet, but the bourgeoisie is involved in this revolution. Working class, factories in the cities. You're seeing that in France beginning to sprout here. Plus the peasants, the royal family, aristocracy, so on and so forth, more moving parts, which also lends to its violence. But here, back in the United States, we didn't have that. We didn't have as violent a revolution, not nearly as violent, really. And that's really a blessing here. It truly is. It truly is. But the Army, you know, we start off with local militias. You know, keep in mind during the French and Indian War, which is a part of the 7 Years' War, you know, 1756 to 1763, you know, you see here that's the British Army, that's really the Army here. And what are the militias from the colonies are really adjuncts to the British Army. They bolster the British Army if manpower is needed. George Washington did this in that campaign in Pennsylvania. You know, he commanded the Virginia militia, which is one of the reasons he's going to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in the beginning. He had combat experience. I mean, there weren't very many officers of that stature who had that to really speak of. And so, you know, however, interesting in that war, the French and Indian War, you know, the average British soldier was carrying like 60, 65 pounds worth of equipment. Now, that army was used to campaigning in Europe. Europe is already developed by comparison. There are cities. Sure, there are farms. You know, there's the agrarian agenda, there's farms. But the industrialization process is ongoing, the Industrial Revolution. We don't have anything near that here. A lot of Europe has been cleared. Roads, again, cities, so on and so forth. And so when an army is on the march, they can steal from the farms and steal from the cities, and they don't have to have that baggage train. You can't have that here. What cities? What cities to speak of? You've got some townships, towns, villages, hamlets, whatever the case may be, and then you're going to see Boston sprout, New York sprout, Baltimore, Philadelphia, things of the, but we don't have that mass amount of cities here, so a lot of the colonies are undeveloped. How can you really have much in the way of linear warfare here, you know, where you get the lines of the guys, right, with their muskets and their bayonets? You can't have a lot of that. What you can have, though, is unconventional war, insurgency, guerrilla, irregulars. And so while the average British soldier is carrying 60, 65 pounds, the average French soldier is carrying 12. Of course, they've sided with the Indians. You're lucky if they got a loincloth on. But it's the Indian that understands how to fight here because they live here. They live here. But the white colonist of the English variety is going to learn this. And which is why that 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, which is what it is here, is a laboratory for what's going to be coming down the pike. Because some of these guys who fought in this war will fight after 1775-76. Only they fought with the British Army. Now they can fight against the British Army. Interesting where that goes. However, you know, having said that about the militia system, you know, these guys really aren't trained in conventional warfare tactics. Not till later on, not till really the war really starts. You know, they're not trained in bayonet charge. You know, they're not coordinated in any of this at all. And so, but what do they know what to do? Hide behind a stone wall, behind a rock, behind a tree. You know, again, we're back to insurgency. The Minuteman, if you want to call them that, it's an irregular. It's what it is. You know, once the call goes out, Joe, Wiz, and Alabama meet at the Common, and they march off, and you know, to meet the British outside the town. And as the redcoats are marching down the road, they take a few pot shots at them, melt back into the trees, and they're back home by 4 o'clock picking their potatoes. And if you were in Vietnam, what do you think the VC were doing? What is it we didn't understand from our own revolution in 1775-76 to 1965 in Vietnam? Well, yeah. Yeah, it's virtually the same thing. And so when you go back to even before 1775, and you see, the British, one of the major reasons you have a revolution anyway is land here. there's more of a justification for your revolution, economic liberty versus human rights or civil rights. Economic liberty is one of the major facets of your revolution, the notion of owning land. Yep. And so when you look at it this way, when the British Crown stopped the colonies from printing their own money in 1764 with the Currency Act, and then later on, because the British don't want to station troops in the outback because it costs them more money, forbidding the colonists to grab land. If you're a poor white in a small town or village and you can't make it, the promise was, I'll go 20 miles, 50 miles west, and I'll grab 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 acres and make a go of it. Now the Crown's telling you you can't. If you can't control your own money, and if you can't get land to expand your horizons, why do I need you for? You meaning the Crown. Throw them out. And so as the British forbid the colonists from getting land, but they're finding it the expense is really not worth it, they begin to pull troops out of the outback and sticking them in the cities. Again, like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Charleston maybe? And so who's minding the store in the outback? The French did the same thing in Spain in 1808. And what happened to them after 5 years? Of course, the Spanish, and there were, get this, 300,000 Spanish guerrillas. And most of them were peasants, many of them uneducated. And the Catholic Church is promising them, hey, look, if you die fighting the French, we'll guarantee a place in heaven. Christmas, that sounds like those Muslim extremists with the 72 virgins, for crying out loud. That's another one that got me, 72 virgins. Since when has God a pimp?
And what happens to them after?
Well, yeah, that's it.
Somebody said they recycle.
Well, yeah, but then again, these are the promises to the people who aren't as well educated. Let's understand this. And so when you take a look at what's going on here, you begin to see, as the British pull their troops out of the outback, 1773, 1774, 1775, people, and it's spontaneous. It's not organized, it's spontaneous. They're pushing out Crown-appointed administrators and assuming local political control. Committees of safety. We had them here in Connecticut. Not everyone's on the same schedule, by the way. Massachusetts, you know, is a hotbed of radicalism. And so when you have these committees of safety, you know, you take local political control, how do you protect them? Militias. You arrange your own militia. However, is this coordinated? No. You know, many of the people in these colonies jealously guarded their autonomy. Well, think about it in this way. You know, somebody in South Carolina. What do I have in common with somebody in Massachusetts? You can't have a revolution this way. You got to get them unified. You got to have it cohesive. You got to bring it together. But this is going on here, and interestingly enough, committees of safety. Committees of safety. Go back to Russia, February 1917, and you begin to see in Petrograd, and this will spread to the environs outside Petrograd, uprisings by soldiers, peasants, and workers taking control of a city block, other sections of Petrograd, and in the outback here, pushing out Tsar-appointed administrators and taking control. These are called Soviets. What's the difference between a Soviet and a committee of safety? Really not much difference. Really not much difference. The Russian Revolution has something in common with ours. Interesting how that is. And you begin to see these militias or groups being formed here to protect those Soviets. But it's spontaneous. It's got to be organized. Hence Lenin. But come back to your own revolution here. And here, you know, this autonomy among the colonies, that's going to be overcome by a couple of documents. You know, in 1775, and it irks me we don't talk about this one or even talk about it in the schools at all. The Declaration of Independence, you know, I give talks on that. on it, not as just the it's an article of faith is what it is, but it's also our birth certificate. But then again, that bounces off the document that came out the year before, July 6, 1775. And I urge you, if you're interested in our founding documents, read that one, because it's signed off on by John Hancock as president of the Continental Congress. And they have listed in that document the grievances. Remember reading the Declaration of Independence, the grievances that Jefferson had listed? Well, where do you think he got some of them from? From the document that came out a year earlier. And this document is called, Declaration of Independence sounds fine, but this one is right in your face. The causes and necessity of taking up arms. There's no mistake about what that means. No mistake. Because there are those who think at this point the time for writing to the local paper or almanac or magazine is over. The time for taking to the streets to protest is over. The time for thumbing your nose at the redcoats is over. It's time to grab a gun and start killing your fellow man. Hence what's going to be known as a revolution. And so the Declaration of Independence is emblematic of this cohesiveness that they need to effect a revolution. 56 signers from 13 colonies signed this document. They have one thing in common here. Let's throw out the crown. Part of this is because we want to control the land. It's pure and simple here. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the major reasons for this. Control the land. We can't control the land unless we throw the crown out of here. And so this leads to this is going to accentuate the fighting here. Now, many men are still fighting as guerrillas because, interestingly enough, again, the formation of this army, the revolution really starts as a civil war between the colonists. Patriots, if you want to use that term, versus the Tories and Loyalists. John Adams always said, in 1776, I think, 1775, 1776, he said the colonists were divided into three groups. Those who were blue, I'm guessing he's meaning true blue. Those who were timid, first those who were Tories, then those who were timid. The fence sitters. Don't you have that in every human endeavor here? People don't know whether to go right or left or straight or back or whatever the case may be. So the other sides are going to try to push them off that fence onto their side. Yet it seems like it's the patriots who are better organized and have that one thing you need to get you to win. They have a better kill instinct to do this. And they also know if they lose, what's going to happen to them. At high end, the British will have 45,000 troops here. They don't have 45,000, I don't think, as of yet. But they are going to have 45,000 troops here. A quarter of them are going to be mercenaries. Remember the Hessians? Yes. Right. But keep in mind, at the same time, 1773, 1775, 76, 77, so on and so forth, the British are moving into the Middle East by 1763. They're stretched. They're stretched. They're stretched, which is why they're going to bring mercenaries here. They're an empire, but they're stretched. And so as the Civil War really started, and there was fighting going on between some of these patriots and Tories. And understand something too. These groups like the Mohawk River Indians, the Sons of Liberty, people like this, they're terrorist groups for crying out loud. This stuff in America, whenever you see in the press and you believe this stuff that Iranians are horrible because they perpetuate terrorism, grow up, they all do. You can't have a guerrilla group and not be a terrorist group. It just doesn't work this way. One man's guerrilla is another man's terrorist. That's a lot of bunk. All guerrilla groups use terrorism to a certain extent. They did here. The Patriots were using terrorism. Things like ride the wooden horse, tarring and feathering, things of this nature. That happened up here in Crane Britton outlined this in Anatomy of Revolution, which if you want to understand revolution, that's a Bible you should read, by Crane Britton. He referenced an incident that happened here up in New Milford rather, in 1776. when these patriots found they had a Tory in their midst and marched them 20 miles. I had him take one of his geese with him and marched them 20 miles to Litchfield where there was a boiling vat of hot tar waiting. And so the guy had to pluck the goose, and then they stripped him naked and hit him with that boiling hot tar. And then hit him with the feathers. What would you call that? Terrorizing, torture? Yeah, okay, so this stuff about the Iran, forget that. You know, Americans did it too, and did it willingly. Of course, the other side of the coin here is they're the underdog. You want to win, you win. It's not hard to figure this out, and they're going to win. And so here, but you can't use just an insurgent warfare to beat the British Army here. And so they're going to try to form an army in 1775, 1776. Now, most of the army will be up north here, because this is where the fighting, you know, as far as an army goes, this is where it really comes into play here. Bunker Hill, Boston, so on and so forth, Breeds Hill, Boston, so on and so forth. And so the army is really a northern army. It's not a southern army, but how do you get the southerners to stay on board here? Give them a southern commander, George Washington. Of course, when George goes to Massachusetts and sees the army he got, oh my God. You know, got to start with something. Got to start with something. But they'll eventually put this army together. Now, how are you going to pay them? That's a problem. That's a problem. You know, you don't have a central government. You are relying here on the beneficence of colonies that are printing their own money. How much do you think that money's worth? Or maybe farmers who will offer some of their chickens and their pigs and their cows, so on and so forth. And people who will turn over maybe some shirts and pants and so on and so forth. Because the Continental Congress is eventually going to promise these guys, hey, look, we'll pay you. How's that going to work? They promise soldiers, we will give you another uniform. You know, uniforms do wear out. You know that. You buy clothes, right? Clothes eventually wear out. We'll feed you. You know, it's going to get to the point, and this is what Benedict Arnold sees by 1778, 1779. Some of these guys are in rags. It wasn't unusual to see 2, 3, 5 soldiers sharing the same coat in the winter months. And this is an army that's going to win. They're going to win. They look like they lost. You know, the British look pretty good in those red uniforms and white pants and black boots, but boy, the thing is the colonists outlasted them is what they did. But the fact of the matter is, you know, there were farmers here. You know, call them patriots, their farms. Some didn't even like to have their army bivouacked next to them because things used to occur known as midnight requisitions. It's one way of putting it. And these soldiers, because they're hungry, would take a chicken or 2 or 3, a pig, a cow. They have to eat. It's nice to be patriotic, but I got to eat. And George Washington even alerts to this in some of his writings. The army has to be supported. You know, I don't think I have it on this one here. I'm not sure if I do. Yes, it's at the end of this handout. The best army in the world is bound to be annihilated unless it is backed by a strong, well-organized home front. That's Vladimir Lenin. Man's right, you know. He is right. Hence his approach to the Red Army. And so, again, of course, as you're getting more to the 20th century, war is becoming more industrialized. That wasn't the case here, although it will showcase itself in the French Revolution, but not here yet. And so, but you still had the People's Army, you know, the guerrilla units, going down to the Carolinas, Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, you know, where you had, open battle in the backwaters of the South here between the Patriots and the Tories. It wasn't unusual, perhaps, to find somebody whether they were a Tory or a patriot, hanging from one of the trees in the forest or stuck with a bayonet or sword in a tree as a warning to everybody else. And yet, interesting here too, you know, when you look at this insurgent effort by the patriots, people will be giving shirts, pants, shoes to the guerrillas, the occasional firearm, powder, and ball. But it's something that the guerrillas most need. Nice to have the people to support them, yes. Information. And even here, you know, Andrew Jackson was schlepping supplies for the guerrillas. But even here, kids 5, 6 years old, keep your eyes and your ears open. Whatever you see, report to your parents or some other adult affiliated with the guerrillas. They will let us know, and we'll take it from there. Even kids 5, 6 years old can be part of this by what they see and what they hear. And you know who's going to use this to great advantage? Years down the road, Mao Zedong. Even writes about it. Of course, that brings another question. Does that make children legitimate military targets? Mull that one over for a little while. Ho is going to do the same thing. That's a people's army. Note the term, people's army. It's not a conventional army, people's army. But it works because, interestingly enough, that guerrilla movement down south is what helps the Continental Army in the end win at Yorktown. You know, the British Army is not going to win down here. They evacuate to Yorktown. Part of that is because of the success of the People's Army. We don't really push that here in this country. The common everyday Joe, like yourself, taking up a gun at risk of life and limb and shooting the occupier. That's how it has to go. People's war can be pretty brutal. Pretty brutal. But on the other side, the Continental Army, you know, George Washington is the general of this army. He's going to win the war, but this is a general that loses more battles than he wins. He outlasted them. Keep in mind, yes, you have globalization at this point, but it's still 3,000 miles from Britain. That's a challenge to supporting this army. That is, especially when you have other commitments around the globe, like the growing Middle East, India, so on and so forth. The islands, you need to station troops there. The West Indies, into Central America. You need to station troops here. And then this disposition of the Royal Navy. And so they have other commitments. They're stretched. They're the superpower of the globe at this point, but they're stretched. America's stretched, isn't it? Why do we hire private contractors if we're not stretched? Of course, part of it is Americans don't want to fight. That's part of the problem. And so you see here by 1779, 1780, some of these guys are still in rags. Some of these guys aren't getting the food they're promised. Pay? Forget it. Keep in mind, these guys are farmers. Who do you think's working the farm? The wife and the kids. Economically, the case is not very good here. And there is going to be restiveness in this army. And you're going to see in 1780, even up here in Hartford, a Connecticut regiment revolts. They were going to march on the Congress in Hartford. It had to be put down. You'll see another Connecticut regiment revolt in New Jersey. That will have to be suppressed. You had some deserters here too. No, George Washington did have some problem with desertions. I mean, if you're not being fed, you're not being paid, you're not given new clothes here. You know, it takes intestinal fortitude to stick with the agenda here. But then again, you think the British will help you? The British could promise to help you, but that makes you a turncoat, doesn't it? You're not only a deserter, but a turncoat? That's a problem. That's a problem. So the country is, what's going to be the United States is not on sure footing here. Even in 17, a Pennsylvania regiment in New Jersey was going to march on, I think it was Pennsylvania regiment, was going to march on Morristown. No, Connecticut regiment was going to march on Morristown. That was where they had supplies and guns and so on and so forth because they're not getting them. That had to be stopped. A Pennsylvania regiment at one point was going to grab cannon and march on the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. That had to be suppressed. It's going to get to the point here, and interestingly enough, and I have it on this handout here, where George Washington, to the commander at West Point, this is on June 22nd, 1781, to the commander at the detachment at West Point, there are 200 New Jersey regulars who are in mutiny here in New Jersey. 200. And they want to march on Morristown just like that Connecticut regiment wanted to. This is George Washington, and I got this from Washington's writings. June 22nd, 1781. To the commander of the detachment at West Point, Sir, you are to take command of the detachment at West Point, which has been ordered to march from this post against the mutineers of the Jersey line. The object of the detachment is to compel the mutineers to unconditional submission, and I desire you will grant no terms while they are with arms in the hands of a state of resistance. If you succeed in compelling the revolted troops to surrender, you will instantly execute a few and the most active and most incendiary leaders. Washington also ordered that local militia units, to this commander, local militia units be attached to his detachment as they're marching to Morristown. And he said, and he writes, and you will also try to avail yourself the services of the militia. And this is how he writes this, representing to them how dangerous to civil liberty the precedent is of armed soldiers dictating terms to their country. In other words, you are to show the militia, you get out of line, guess what? And interesting here, the ringleaders of this mutiny, they are ordered to pick some of their number, and 2 of them are going to be shot. That's Washington's Stalinist approach. Of course, if that was Stalin, all 200 would have been shot. What is it Voltaire once said? If you, the French philosopher once said, if you want to keep your army in line, periodically take a general out and shoot him. Stalin must have read that someplace. Yes? Beg your pardon? Yeah, but he also, right, but Voltaire also said the same thing. Right. In that Art of War. Right. And so, interesting here, at this point, many of these guys are complaining. Now, again, this isn't, we don't have a lock on this. Go back to France in 1917. And that's even more of a hell, the trenches on the Western Front. Upwards of 54 divisions of French troops mutinied. 54 divisions. And if you want to have an understanding of how many men that is, multiply each of these divisions by about 14,000 men and see what you get. That's a lot of men. Picture yourself in these trenches on and off for 3 years. Picture yourself with bad food. Again, the clothing issue here. How about some time off? How about better food? How about a better regard by the French officers? And you know who's going to be the hero here? Marshal Henri Pétain, who's going to be the GOAT of Vichy France later on. He visited 90 divisions Forget the 54. He visited 90 divisions altogether. What's the gripe? What can we do for you? What can we do to help? This kind of thing. Upwards of 400 soldiers are going to be arrested. 54 will be shot. And some of those who were arrested or apprehended, guess where some of them are going to wind up? Devil's Island. Wow. Interesting here, this idea of maintaining military discipline. But having a problem with soldiers is one thing. Better food and more of it. Back pay. How are you going to pay these guys? You know, by 1782, 1783, what kind of a financial footing do you think the colonies are on? It's horrible here. And you think the money really holds water? No. No. Back pay, food, uniforms. If you step back and take a look at this from the perspective of the private, the corporal, and sergeant, it's like a union problem. That's a job action. That's not what it is with the officers. The officers were promised a half-pay pension for life. Where is that money going to come from? And on top of that, by 1779, 80, 1781, 82, 83, you know, a Continental Army, I'm an officer. I might have a job for life in this brand new army. No, there's noises from the Continental Congress that they're going to disband most of the Continental Army. How do you think that sets with an officer here who has ideas of maintaining this as a career? Where do you go from here? That's a problem. And when you create an officer class, take a look at the free officers movement in Egypt with Nasser. What has that turned into? The army has run that country for decades. It became a political class. So when you take a look at the American officer class, you're beginning to create an important class in your social structure. And when they find out that maybe that Continental Army that will exist after the war won't be large enough to include all these officers, what do you think some of them are thinking here? Why am I here? And how am I going to improve my economic situation when this war is over? And in 1783, the officers are up in Newburgh, New York. That's where many of them are stationed. And then the machinations begin. You know, some of them go to the Continental Congress, we need to be paid, and Robert Morris is going to tell them, I don't have any money. That's not the answer they want to hear. And then, you know, it's murky here. What Alexander Hamilton is doing in the background here. He wants a strong central government. And it's been stated here that he was willing to support the officers as long as they are willing to support strong central government. Now you know the word for that. It's called blackmail. Maybe use the army to create strong central government here? And Horatio Gates. Gates, by the way, considered the hero at Saratoga in 1777, is a rival of George Washington. He thought he should have been chosen to be the commander of the army, not Washington. And his part in this, maybe trying to take the Continental Army himself. There are officers here who wanted, by the way, a strong central government. Even some who wanted to make George Washington a king here. Washington, I want to go home. And yet, on March 15, 1783, there's supposed to be a meeting here with these officers and Horatio Gates. Who shows up unannounced? George Washington. And he walks into that barracks that they have there for the officers, and there's a little stage here. And I don't know how many of you know that George Washington was a fan of stage play, drama. And being a fan of stage play, when he walks in, well, Gates relinquishes the stage here, and he gets up there and he begins to talk to these officers. And he tries to impress upon them that the country, we need to have a sound government that's going to come. Your issues will be addressed, but you have to have patience. You have to have patience. You have to wait. Interesting here what he said, and this is one of the things he said here, and I have this on the front page. And let me conjure you in the name of our common country. Get a load of that, common country. Note the terminology here. As you value your own sacred honor and you respect the rights of humanity. Note the wording here. He was a very good writer, George Washington, and that's kind of overlooked here. And as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any specious pretenses, to overturn the liberties of our country. We're not a country yet. And who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge, note the terminology here, and deluge our rising empire in blood. Now note when you read this, I have the E in empire capitalized and the B in blood capitalized. That's how it was back then. Is he reinforcing this message? Interestingly enough, at one point here as he's doing this, he reaches into his coat here, his military tunic, and he pulls out his glasses, and he makes great fanfare of putting, here we go with stage play, putting the glasses on, and everyone's waiting. And he says something to the effect, I understand, you're missing money and so on and so forth. He says, I also lost something in service to my country, my eyesight. And what do you think happened to the wind in the sails of these malcontents? There were even some officers now dripping at the eyelids here. And he reinforced the fact, I have been with you in the good times and the bad times, the winter, the snow, the heat. He was. And there were many who still found him, still enamored with this personality of George Washington. And so the threat posed by the officers, the air went out of that bag. Now, interestingly enough, they're going to get IOUs here for what they're going to have to be owed. But this is 1783, not 1787. The Constitutional Convention. You are not going to have a large standing army. And some of these officers are going to be mustered out of the army. It's the IOUs that are in question here. And it's not just officers, the men. Some can't wait, and they sell their IOUs. Do you think they got the face value of the IOUs? No. They need money now. It's almost like what those bonus soldiers were asking for in 1930, 31, 32 during the Hoover administration at the Senate on Washington, and then MacArthur is going to be the one to push them out. And so many of these guys sold these. Keep in mind, many of these guys are going to wind up in poverty. Some will get paid, but it's not until 1818 that Congress passed legislation to really acknowledge these debts. And guess what? By 1818, many of these guys are already dead. So who benefited? The families. And keep in mind, it's the same thing that people who bought bonds and other financial instruments in this country at face value in the hopes of getting paid off by a country that's going to win the war. Even some of these people couldn't wait and sold off those investment vehicles for not what they're not the face value. It's interesting here what's going on at this point in your country's history. And Congress is going to learn this lesson. Because they don't want a large standing army because they consider it a threat to the Republic. They're going to use the example of Britain. Yes, they'll use the example of Rome. They'll use the example of the Greek states, going back to history, even around the time of Sun Tzu. And so they want a small standing army. And so when the country is finally on a footing here, you're going to have approximately 3 million people in 13 states with an army of 2,630 men. How are 2,630 men going to protect 13 states? These guys better be good. No. Militia system. Every white male 18 to 45 is part of the militia system. And it's not run by Washington or the Army. It's run by the governors. The governors control most of the military potential of the United States. And the officers in these militias are not appointed by the Army or Washington. They're appointed by their states. And now all these white males don't think the government's going to buy your gun. You have to buy it. You buy your own gun, your own powder, your own ball, your own shirt, your own pants, your own shoes, whatever the case may be. And you can only be federalized for 3 months, although it says in the Constitution if the president needs more men, he can ask the Congress to federalize the militias, which he's at power to do. And yet, for 3 months, according to the 1792 Militia Act, and after that 3 months, guess what the president has to do? Go back to Congress and want another 3 months. That's how this is an example of throwing it back to the states. You know that thing, states' rights? But then again, to have more of the citizenry through their states control most of the military. Of course, this is not an army looking to invade Iraq. This is an army looking to protect their towns, their homes, and their farms. But they learned from this. Yes? Well, you can see in the background of that empire, land. They know we're going west here. You know, Washington wants to add to his holdings. Jefferson wants to add to his holdings here. You know, but at the same time here, coming out of the Continental Congress, you know, when they pass what's going to be the Constitution and so on and so forth, and then the states have to ratify it. You know, I mean, if you ever take a look at Connecticut back then, the land claims of Connecticut, the border would have been up to the Mississippi River, the Hudson River, and then we had land more toward the Midwest that we're not going to get that. North Carolina was stretched out. They're not going to get that. Interesting. Take a look at a map and see that. Empire, land, a contiguous empire. We're going to march. We're going to march. I mean, that's what the Northwest Ordinance is for, 1787, the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican-American War, and eventually the Spanish-American War. Of course, that changes manifest destiny. But you know, the word empire, keep in mind, in fact, I have the business cards up there. I have a brand new website out, markreiter.org. I kept markreiter.com, but markreiter.org. And the website is called, it's markreiter.org, but the other title to it is Empire of Reason. Now, I chose that title because in 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was on, he was teaching in Philadelphia at the same time, but this gentleman knew a lot of the founders. He's that Connecticut wordsmith, Noah Webster. And he's alluding to the fact, and I find it fascinating, going back again to this term empire, that he said the founders really weren't putting together a country, they're putting together an empire of reason. Who the heck writes like that anymore? You're not getting it today, that's for sure. And so when you read what George Washington's writing, when you read what, and Noah Webster is interesting, he's not taking part in the discussions in Independence Hall. What he is doing, he's joining the founders after hours here, writing all this stuff up and putting it in the newspapers, magazines, almanacs. You know, your founders were debating this stuff in the hall and outside the hall, on the streets, on the corners. That's great, street corner politics. Sure don't have that anymore. You know, where you're really talking to the people here, it's fascinating to, I always found that fascinating. So when you see the word empire, interesting. Fascinating use of terms here. It really is. Of course, when you read a lot of what your founders are writing in this period, you know, it's not just history or political science, folks. This is an English class. This is an English class, which is why I chose that term for my new website, Empire of Reason. And there's going to be a lot of things about American history on that site. And so that site is going to be a history political site. The old site I had, if you were going to that for the calendar of events, it's not being updated right now. If you want the calendar of events, you go to markwriter.org. Because you went there, Keith. The calendar of events is a lot easier to read. Yeah, they did a really good job with it. They really did what I wanted. But the old one, markwriter.org, later this year, markwriter.com, I'm going to have that changed to a history military site. So I'm going to have the two of them. And some of the research I do up at Army Aviation Magazine is going to go on that new site. And so I'm going to have the two. But right now I'm using markwriter.org. But again, the terminology, empire, that's no accident, by the way. That is no accident. But here you see afterwards that your Congress, your Continental Congress, did not want a large standing army. They saw it as a threat to the Republic. That's what they saw it as. And besides, if you don't have a large army, how much money are you saving here? Look at it that way. And not a large navy either. You know, when Jefferson's president, he's a cheapskate. He'll spring for a $10,000 gunboat, but not a $300,000 frigate. So, you know, but they, you know, and many of your founders believed instead of war, how about commerce? You have something I want, I have something you want, let's trade. What do we need large armies and large navies for? Trade can keep the peace. How'd that work out? So it's interesting. I'll agree, some of your founders carried baggage, and you know they do, but you have to give the devil its due here. But again, that use of the term empire is to be duly noted here. And they're not the only, and Washington and Noah Webster weren't the only ones. Jefferson used that term empire. In fact, Jefferson, I think, wrote in 1808, if we could take control of Cuba, that would be a good jump-off point to spread republicanism south. Wow. Interesting. And so, again, here you see, with this small army, it's considered by many in Congress the threat to Republican government has been, you know, the military threat has been eliminated because of a small army. And that's what they wanted. Of course, the threat to that is going to be 1861 to 1865. When by April 9, 1865, the United States Army, or Union Army, if that's what you want to call it, is 2,213,000 men. The largest army in the history of North America up to this point. And it's a blooded army, and it's a pretty darn good army. But within 2 years, again, Congress, even Congress then, the members of Congress were privy to the notion that a large army like that could prove to be a problem. And by September of 1867, it's down to 57,000 men. cashiered the rest of them. And by the time Custer bought the farm in 1876, there's only 26,000 men left in the United States Army. Yep. Wow. And so many of the precepts of the founders were still preserved here in the latter stages of the 19th century. But of course, as America is going to take its place on the stage, you can't have governors commanding most of the military. And interesting, when you go back to the War of 1812, there were governors who told Madison, my guys aren't fighting outside the state border. How can you have a military like this if you're being invaded, right? You're going to war with the British Empire? My guys aren't fighting outside the state border. That happened in the 1898 war with Spain. There were governors who told McKinley, my guys aren't fighting outside the state borders. If the Spain invades us, okay. And so that's when McKinley had to put out the call for volunteers. He's got an army of 26,000 men, and most of them are used to just fighting Plains Indians. Now you're going to take out a European army. He called for volunteers. He had almost 200,000 men. And so now we're going to go fight in Cuba, the Philippines. We're going to grab Guam and Puerto Rico. And so now the country changes. And so in 1903, that 1792 Militia Act, which I alluded to, really bolsters what you call the Second Amendment here. The right for the citizen to bear arms shall not be infringed, the militia, so on. Well-regulated militia. Remember the terminology. What you have today is not a well-regulated militia. The National Guard's a bona fide reserve of the United States Army. You don't have a well-regulated militia anymore. That's over. So in 1903, when the National Guard Act is passed, interesting here where the country is going, away from the militia system, that these militias, now known as National Guard, these guys don't buy their own guns anymore. Guess who's doing that? Taxpayer. Bolt Action Crag Jorgensen and Bolt Action Springfield, the 03. And now these guys have to train with the Army 5 days a year. And now they're going to start getting paid for those 5 days. And they have to meet on their own 24 days a year. Oh, and by the way, if the president federalizes them, it's no longer 3 months, it's 9. And then in 1908, subsidiary legislation is passed allowing these guardsmen to be sent overseas. Some governors don't like that one. And then in 1916, with the National Defense Act, because this is a year before we get into the First World War, the National Guard now has to train with the Army, not 5 days anymore, 15. And they no longer meet 24 days, 48. And now they start getting paid by the U.S. government for the 48 days. And now they can be federalized for the duration. And then in 1920, the 1920 National Defense Act, the general of the National Guard now has a seat on the general staff. See what's happened here? Washington has grabbed more and more control of what you used to call militias. And by 1933, a National Guardsman is not only taking an oath to his state, he's now taking an oath to who? Washington. That's a bona fide reserve of the United States Army. And so, but was the Second Amendment ever changed? No. No. But the 1792 Militia Act was superseded by the 1903 National Guard Act. Interesting here, what happened here back in the colonial era, and then what transpired afterward as America took its place on the world stage. Well, through much of your history too, there were decisions rendered by judges that stated that the Second Amendment doesn't give the citizen the right to own a firearm or have a lot of firearms because of the militia system. We don't have that militia system anymore. So how can you have a firearm if you don't have a militia system anymore? If the government gives the National Guard guns, how can the citizen have access to firearms?
So what is the answer to that?
That's the problem. That's the problem. The Second Amendment was not restructured, or they didn't have a debate on the Second Amendment, perhaps, when they got rid of the 1792 Militia Act. You know, I mean, keep in mind what bolsters this too are the days of the Old West, too. You know, what is it? God made man, but Colt made him equal. If you remember that saying. But I mean, you know, the military end of this. Pardon me, the military end of this. You know, again, the 1792 Militia Act is superseded by the 1903 National Guard because the country changed. You know, manifest destiny is no longer a continental agenda of expanding this contiguous empire across this wondrous land. Because with the Spanish-American War, we are now taking manifest destiny overseas. And it's no longer people like you grabbing land. I can't make it here in Darien, or I can't make it in Norwalk. I'm going 100 miles west to grab free land. Well, free land, it's Indian land. They're taking it from the Indians. So I can grab my 20, 50, 100, 500 acres and make a go of it. Those days are gone. That's gone. Having said that, that's what drove this country. It was the common everyday, the common everyday white man in this country was that engine of imperialism. You know, we're not like the British, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, or one of these continental European colonial powers where they go grab someone's land and plant a flag here. I'm getting this from my monarch. No, we're different. It's people like yourselves who wanted land. That's the engine of the engine of the American imperialist system of the 19th century. That's manifest destiny. And the businessman's going to follow, the bank's going to follow, the railroads are going to follow, the telegraph's going to follow. And so, but after the 1898 war, it's no longer Ma, Pa, Kettle grabbing land, it's now the Army and the Navy. And so you can't have a militia system anymore. It's got to be a National Guard. That's controlled, sure, for some reasons by the governors, but guess what? When the country needs men, and for the duration, and then there's drawbacks to that because in 2006, if you remember when Katrina hit Mississippi and Louisiana, and the governor wanted National Guard troops in New Orleans to maintain order, help with cleanup, this kind of thing, where was much of the Louisiana National Guard? In Iraq. You don't think that's not an issue for that governor? An undeclared war, too. And so I give policemen from New York and Boston a lot of credit. Those who volunteered their time to go down there and lend a hand. You got to give people like that a lot of credit. From Boston and New York going down there? Wow. Fascinating. Fascinating. But that was the reason your founders, you know, you go back to these mutinies and there were a number of them. There were a number of these mutinies and revolts. These guys need to be paid. They need to eat. They need new uniforms. You promised them. You promised to get, and isn't that a trademark of a functioning government here? One would think. Well, then what the heck am I fighting for? What do I need you for? That's a problem. And so when George Washington puts the brakes on this, you know, and George Washington, if he could have been talked into it, can you imagine him taking control of the country? He doesn't do that. You know, I don't think we appreciate it enough that we didn't wind up with an Oliver Cromwell or a Julius Caesar or a Napoleon here. Yeah, we're lucky. We could have been another banana republic for Pete's sakes. I don't think we appreciate that enough here. I really don't. And yet this is the same guy who when he is out of office in 1796, he didn't want to be president. I want to go home. No, you got to stick around. So he serves a term, you start a second term. No, I want to go home. No, you got to stick around. And yet when he does leave, his farewell address is really worth reading. It's one of the best of any president. And he warns about over-bloated militaries. He ought to know. And so when you read that in his farewell address, fast forward to what Eisenhower says in 1961. Now, if anybody would know, it would be Eisenhower and Washington, right? Weren't they generals? They were also presidents, weren't they? Right. And also Washington warned about parties. Parties breed factionalism. And factionalism, you will find in factionalism in these parties, people who will be more allied to their party than the nation. Holy Christmas. He writes this. It's a wonderful read. It truly is. Beware of parties. And he also states in this thing that, each section of the country can't be separate. You know, the South brings something to the table, the North brings something to the table, the East brings something to the table, the West brings something to the table. That's a functioning country. Not this tribalism. He was against that. He was against that. At least he writes that way. It's a brilliant piece of pen work, it really is. But, you know, he kind of saw what was coming with Federalists as opposed to Democrats, Republicans. And that goes on from there. Interesting gentleman, George Washington. Interesting gentleman. Like I said, he carried baggage like everybody else. But, you know, in the end here, the proof's in the pudding here, what he did. Like I said, we're lucky we didn't wind up with an Oliver Cromwell or a Julius Caesar or a Napoleon. It's stated that George III, when they found out that after the war that George Washington wanted to go home and wasn't going to take control of the country, George III didn't believe it. If he ever does that, he'd be the greatest man in the world. Yeah, because the Articles of Confederation really don't give the power to tax. And so you're asking these, they're not even states yet, you're asking these colonies to contribute to the cause here. You know, if you want to, you know, contribute some cows, some chickens, some pigs, and money. Well, that money doesn't hold a lot of, there's nothing really backing it up. I mean, that goes back to the Currency Act of 1764, when the British forbid the colonists from printing their own, because if you can print your own money, you're on your way to independence. And we don't want that. You know, we want to control the colonies. We don't want them printing their own money here. Yet at the same time, there was a lack of gold and silver. Isn't that really the genuine coin of the realm here?
This was before the central bank.
Yeah, oh yeah, you don't have one yet. You don't have one yet. You don't have one yet. These are tough times here. They really are. They really are. And is that really taught here? No. And so when you step back and you take a look at what this was like, not even 1780, 1779, 1778, this is a close run thing in the end. This is a close run thing. Especially when you got people, look at all this land. Imagine all that land in the hands of a few. Christmas, we would have wound up like the French or the Russians, for Pete's sakes. Thank God we didn't. Yes, sir. You carried it. You carried it. I mean, you control the seas, you can do that easily enough. But does that take time? How long is a boat journey from Europe to the United States? Beg your pardon? You can carry French francs. Or livres, really. Right. But then again, keep in mind though, at the same time, Americans got to be pretty good smugglers. And so when the British really didn't want gold and silver coming here, keep in mind that the Navigation Acts of 1757, the Crown outlawed the export of gold and silver to the colonies. Well, how are they going to pay the taxes and dues and fees that you want them to pay in the 1760s and 1770s? Hence, one of the reasons they're going to print their own money. But at the same time, through smuggling, there's Dutch gold getting in here, there's French gold getting in here, and there's Spanish gold getting in here. No, coins, that kind of thing. But then that puts the British in a dilemma too. If you borrowed to fight the 7 Years' War, like the French government did, if you borrowed to fight the 7 Years' War, and you're going to tax the colonists to pay for some of the cost of the troops stationed here, do you honestly think you're going to collect that colonial script and send that to the banking institutions? No, they want gold and silver. That's an issue. And so if there's not enough gold and silver here, and you're telling them they can't print their own money, where do you think some of the economy is going by 1770, 1774? I mean, Benedict Arnold has an issue here, because when he set up his own, he got involved with another fellow, and they created a small trading company. He had 3 ships. He commanded one of the ships. Things were fine in 1763, 1764, but once the Tea Act came out, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, where do you think his business went? And so the United States, what we call the United States, is really not on a sound financial footing for any length of time until Alexander Hamilton straightens out the financial problem here. And that's not going to be until 1791 when the Bank of the United States will be formed, and really not until 1795. That's a long stretch here. That's a long stretch. So money is at a premium here. However, you do have an asset here in abundance, which can be held in value, land. Right. So many of these people are what? Land rich and money poor? But then again, how can the Continental Congress address this issue of money for the Continental Army? And it's really not till 1818 that these families are really going to get paid off. And then when you take a look at what happened to these, how we treat soldiers in this country, how long did it take guys that got poisoned with Agent Orange to be addressed? And now there's a movement afoot now to finally address the issue of the burn pits for soldiers today that had been in Iraq. We seem to have a problem here treating the soldiers at certain points here on an even keel here. Yeah, but you don't have a central bank either. You don't have a central bank that's going to take control of finance here. And so when you're going back to what you mentioned earlier about the colonists, the colonists printing their money in, Georgia, so on and so forth, you have people printing money, but then again, some colonies are pretty good at gauging how much money to print versus the economic interaction going on. And so when you understand that concept, well, if inflation starts up, you cut back on the money supply, or you tax to take some of the money out of the system. That leads to Shays' Rebellion, which I'll get into more next week. The question you're asking really goes there, because there were some colonies that really, by the way, had a pretty good handle on things. Like I think Pennsylvania did at one point, New York did at one point, Massachusetts was a basket case. Rhode Island even tried to legislate allegiance to the money. And so when that legislation came out, many lenders said, so long, we're leaving Rhode Island. And then Rhode Island tried to force them to be allied to the currency. Well, you're going to force them, they're going to leave. And so that's a problem, because because Rhode Island got to be a basket case economically, by 1780, 87, and so on and so forth, because we don't have a country yet. But again, these colonies jealously guarded their independence. And so if you're trying to create a country here, you better give them a reason to stick. It's nice to say, yeah, okay, well, we want the crown out of here. That's the glue at this point. Well, by 1787, that's no longer the glue. You need to find something else. And so the Constitutional Convention, they'll create this system, right. But then again, when I get to the Alien and Sedition Acts, you're going to see the Kentucky and Virginia resolves passed, where, with the Alien and Sedition Acts, maybe, just maybe here, that the Constitution is really a compact. And if a state does not agree with the compact, what's an alternative? Leave? Secede. Right. 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 But that's during wartime, though, too, here. And so people are still together because we're going to throw the crown out of here. But again, underneath here is the justification for this. The land. The land. Economic freedom. Let's get rid of the crown. Economic freedom. That was one of the rallying cries for the French Revolution. Economic freedom. Capitalism, industrial revolution. And of course that leads to, well, what kind of country are we going to have? Agrarian-based, or are we going to go with industrialization and finance? Again, now we're back to Jefferson versus Hamilton here. But it's still economic freedom. And I know I got this stuff in school too, freedom, liberty, so on and so forth. Yeah, that's fine, that's part of the agenda. But if you don't control the land, what good is it? Land is a determinant of power. Was, is, still is. Yes, Keith? Yeah, because you need horses, you need to eat, and you need clothes, and so on and so. You need ammunition, you need firearms. But then again, as Mao said, as Mao was asked in 1930, was it 1937, 38? He was asked. Oh no, it was during the war. When trying to kick the Japanese out of China. And the communists were really the army, not Chiang Kai-shek. He was asked by a British journalist, I don't see any factories or foundries here. He goes, where are your factories and foundries? He said, they're in the United States and Britain. He says, so when they give the arms to Chiang Kai-shek's army, every once in a while they'd steal them. He wrote that. A guerrilla army begs, borrows, and steals. You raid a police station, you raid an armory, and after a while you build up your cache of arms here until later on you can produce your own. He says that's the essence of guerrilla warfare. You steal. And that's what he said. But that journalist was funny. Where are your foundries? Where are your factories? He says they're in England. He says they're in Britain and the United States. Yes. Yeah, but I still think one of the reasons he was killed, forget this stuff, he was responsible for killing Americans. That's public consumption. But one of the reasons he's killed, because back in December, China, Russia, and Iran had military exercises. You don't think Washington is sending Moscow and Peking a message here? What are you doing? What are you going to do? Kill one of Putin's men? Or one of Xi Jinping's men here? That's to send a message. We don't like that. Okay. So, that's part of this. That's part of this. Otherwise, that's it. Have a good afternoon.